Brussels has changed, though.
It's got a real contemporary art scene.
And it's much richer as a city than it used to be.
Yeah, but it's like a whole EU.
Yeah, there's a lot of commercial activity. The museums are a little feeble. But with the Pompidou opening there, that'll change a little bit. They just won't give a proper amount of money to the Royal Museum, and Vils is like an outsider because it's so left wing. And each of those museums has a kind of hobble on it somehow. It's not Paris, let's put it that way. The collections at people's houses are really quite amazing.
Amazing private architecture, too.
It's the way they live. They live very fancy. We went to a couple of houses, and it's impressive.
Yeah.
We went to the palace.
Meet with the.
They were both away. We walked around a little bit. We have the Princess of Luxembourg is the president of the group I was with. So her husband's their first cousin. So they let us poke around a little bit. How you can be royal in today's world?
It's a little strange to be sitting here, right? It's just that there's a lot. I mean, the lights are very strong right now.
Yeah.
But I see that they made this room, very,
Right.
really good with
I
the
don't think there's any control
on this light.
to have a little less light.
Well,
Good to have an infusion of new ideas.
Yeah.
there should be.
I can barely hang on to the ones I got. They're a video.
Now that she's in the ivory tower and she doesn't have to actually implement any of these things.
She loves it too. She's so happy. Not raising money, not going to board meetings, not having to solve everybody's problems. That's the biggest thing about the museum world. They come to you with their problems, like you know the answer. No, I don't know the answer. You're 61 years old, you figure it out. Oh, here comes some little guys. I had one idea in the taxi. What was it? Taxonometric. To, what do I call it now? Sort of mood enhancement.
So that clock is a little faster.
Big shows this year.
Yeah, I've got shows in
Yeah,
January.
so it's starting in about 2 minutes. Okay.
Ceil, Art and Empires on the Shore of the Sahara.
And I saw it was at Jean-Claude Marion's on Sunday night.
Oh.
I saw some.
Some of his
Tony,
pieces.
he's got a brilliant collection.
Good evening, and welcome to the special public program, Arts, Politics, Museums, New Issues, New Actors. It's a program organized by the Committee on Global Thought in conjunction with its larger transnational research project, a multi-year project called Politics of Visual Arts in a Changing World. And it's a project that's supported by a major grant from Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Special thanks to our co-sponsors, the School of the Arts at Columbia, along with our undergraduate committee on global thought, or UCGT as we call it, and Art Table. I'm Vishakha Desai, Senior Advisor for Global Affairs to the President, President Bollinger that is, and Vice Chair of CGT and President Emerita of Asia Society. Let me thank all of you for coming here tonight and actually choosing us over the first part of the presidential debate. So I appreciate that. I also want to thank those of you who are joining us remotely as the program is being live streamed on the CGT website through YouTube. Let me just say a word about why this project and why now. It's very clear that art, and especially art museums, particularly the larger ones, have increasingly come under fire from progressive groups of activists and artists, occupying the front pages of mainstream publications and other media. The protests that you hear about, whether it's at the Whitney or the Modern or the Guggenheim or the British Museum, range from demands from removal of benefactors to removal or even destruction of works of art. Additionally, claims for repatriation and restitution of works to formerly colonized or enslaved or occupied communities have reached new levels of urgency, leading to serious existential questions about art in Western museums. Underlying these politically charged protests, especially here in the US, is the changing perception of institutions that were designed initially when they originated in the 19th century as, and I quote from various mission statements, temples of learning, inspiring awe and encouraging contemplation. Those institutions were also, of course, organized to give credibility to this new country as a civilized nation. These museums have been in the crosshairs of political currents at different times, notwithstanding their lofty aspirations. In the 1960s and 70s, museums responded to civil rights activism and other political protests, including those that were right here on Columbia campus. And what the museums did was at least to try some efforts to engage with broader communities. Some of us, or those of us who became museum professionals in that era of the late 60s and early 70s, were often attracted to the social engagement potential of art and art museums. We were excited about the unique power of art to be both of a specific time and place and its capacity to connect across history, geography, and divergent and different groups of people. Recognize the exclusion of certain communities in mainstream institutions. This was also the time when you had development of new museums, Studio Museum, Museo del Barrio, expanding the ecology of the art institutions throughout the United States. Despite the culture wars of 1990s and the pressures that came from more conservative side of the politics, causing strains among those who fought for the art and expression of freedom of thought and imagination, and those who found such freewheeling expressions offensive to their core beliefs. At different times, the roles of museums get contested precisely because of this tension between the independent aura of a work of art as thought about in especially Euro-American art, and the related images of institutions that exhibit them or own them as existing above the fray of social and political concerns on the one hand, and on the other hand, the role of these objects as well as institutions as products of a given time and a place on the other hand. How do we make sense of the uproar around the role of art museums in the politically charged climate, along with glaring economic disparities which we find all around us, especially at this moment in time? What does the future hold? Where do we go from here? To help us make sense of these changing roles of museums and challenges confronted by them, from the perspective of the museum colleagues themselves, we have three distinguished guests providing many different perspectives. Our panelists represent three different kinds of institutions with different personal, professional trajectories. And they can really help us and provide a more nuanced perspective on the issues that are around us as we hear about them in various publications and so forth. You have detailed bios of our panelists, so I won't repeat all of their accomplishments, but let me just say, starting with my immediate left, Richard Armstrong, the director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation and the museum, and a passionate champion of arts and artists from around the world. Next to Richard is Alisa LaGamma, curator in charge of the Department of Arts and Africa, Oceania, and the Americas at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Well known for her outstanding scholarship and contribution to rethinking of the history of sub-Saharan African art and history. Next to Alisa is Betti-Sue Hertz, the newcomer to Columbia family, a newly appointed director and chief curator of the Wallach Art Gallery at the university, and known for her exhibitions focused on global exchange and political agency from South Africa to China, and for her work with cultural activists right here in the New York area. So what we're going to do is to ask each one of our guests to have a 5-minute reflection on the subject of arts, politics, and the changing role of museums. And then we'll have a conversation among us, and we will definitely open it up to all of you, the audience. And I hope that those of you who are watching this live, if you have comments and questions, please send it to the CGT website, and we'll try to deal with it after the program. So please join me in welcoming our 3 distinguished guests, and we'll begin with Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishakha. A very brisk stir of the stew. As Vishakha said, I'm the head of the Guggenheim Museum in New York and the titular head of the other Guggenheims in Venice and in Bilbao and soon in Abu Dhabi. And it's given me the opportunity to recognize that although the museum, when I arrived 11 years ago, was calling itself a global institution, it really had a very strong predilection for Europe and the United States, and that was the globe. And I think in this long gestation of the Abu Dhabi project, we've been obliged and introduced to big achievement around the world, and it's actually had a big impact on the way the Guggenheim thinks today, and we'll talk about that in a bit. I thought it might be interesting for you to see the opening day, which we'll be celebrating next week. This is 60 years ago, but it might have been 200 years ago from the way people are dressed and the style of the cars. But I think what's interesting about the Guggenheim was from its earliest days, it was a nonconformist. So Vishakha's point about museums being temples of thought and contemplation, really, even though the first director of the museum asked Frank Lloyd Wright literally for a temple of the spirit, this was a museum unlike any other that had been built until its time by a very hard-headed and I'd say anti-art-oriented architect. Another view of that, I don't know why I'm so focused on it, but I find it quite interesting. I say that because this is 1959. I visited the museum for the first time in 1969, and I would argue that the museum, didn't understand itself until 1979. So the period 1959 to the late 1970s, in my opinion, although often the site of very interesting exhibitions, was not able to fully understand Frank Lloyd Wright's building, and I might argue that this Joseph Beuys exhibition from 1979 was the first time the museum understood its capacity to be fully radical, which I saw, and we did think it was hugely radical. And if you lived in New York in the 1970s, you might also recognize retrospectively that we had no information from Europe or anywhere else in the world except through Sana Ben Gowrie. We were really very inward focused in those years, much to our detriment. Now, how's that changed because you're interested in new actors and new issues? I might argue the issues are very much the same. The actors have probably changed. So the museum went from being a taxonometric exercise, beginning with Kandinsky, up to a kind of version of contemporary art, to this kind of situation. So this is 2011, where the contemporary artist Maurizio Cattelan proposed that everything he'd ever made be suspended from the oculus of the museum, which was in itself quite a big experiment because we were within about 200 pounds of the museum collapsing. But in any case, you were allowed and encouraged to walk up the ramps and see his production in a very different way, I think, than would have been true even 5 years before, but certainly 50 years before. And then finally, you may have seen this James Turrell installation. Here I might argue, and this is where I'll stop, that we've gone from having the privilege and duty of being taxonometric to having the duty of being mood enhancers.
Alisa?
Good evening. A lot shorter. My area of specialization, African art history, is a field that has always been immensely broad in scope. It covers an entire subcontinent from antiquity to the present, as well as every media imaginable, including, crucially, the performing arts. Over the last century, representation of Africa's historical traditions in U.S. institutions made the transition from being relegated to ethnographic or anthropology museums like the ones in Europe that are currently in the limelight to fine arts institutions. Major developments were the opening of the Metropolitan's Michael C. Rockefeller Wing in 1982 and the National Museum of African Art that is part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. a few years later. In the last decade, contemporary artists from the region are finally receiving overdue critical and commercial recognition internationally in venues ranging from the Venice Biennale to the Guggenheim. At this very moment, you can walk up to the Metropolitan's main entrance and look up at Wangechi Mutu's Queens, enthroned in the niches of our Fifth Avenue facade, and enter the Africa galleries to view the works of classical African art that inspired her. And those are some of her first sketches for this project. That used as a point of departure this Luba caryatid stool from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's not self-evident to the public, but in order to overcome enormous cultural biases of the past, this state of affairs is the outcome of a combination of advocacy of many generations of individuals in the cultural sector. Some of these were in the curatorial ranks of smaller cultural institutions on the front lines of those fields, including the Studio Museum in Harlem and the former Museum of Primitive Art that is now the Metropolitan's Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas Department. Others were public intellectuals as far back as W.E. Du Bois and Alain Locke, father of the Harlem Renaissance. Early collections of African art were foundational to education at the centers of higher education they shaped, notably Howard University. You see on the right works of African art that Alain Locke gave to Howard, and Howard's precursor, Hampton Institute in Virginia. On the left, a photograph from the very beginning of the 20th century of works of African art brought back by William Shepard, an African-American who was the first to visit the Kuba court in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Artists such as the Chicago-born Charles White, who was greatly influenced by Locke, sought out African art both at Hampton Institute and in New York City at Nelson Rockefeller's private Museum of Primitive Art that was across from the Museum of Modern Art during the 1950s and 60s. For Du Bois, Locke, and civic activists, artists, and African art specialists here in the US, the separation of Africa as other, isolated from the mainstream of world art, was a source of inequity that required redress. And here you see Nelson Rockefeller with Adlai Stevenson and at the moment of Africa's independence year, with an exhibition celebrating that turning point in world history. On the right, works from Nelson Rockefeller's collection now at the Met, being prepared to be sent to Dakar for the important 1966 exhibition organized there to celebrate African civilizations. So that inequity that needed to be redressed was a false divide, and American museums have sought to play an active role in advancing a more expansive understanding of sub-Saharan African artists' achievements. On the screen, you can see installation shots from one of the program of exhibitions we've been doing at the Met to contribute to that great need that exists. This is an exhibition that places the art of the reliquary in Central Africa in dialogue with world art. As institutions that formed collections in the post-independence era, the works we care for were transferred to us from private individuals who acquired them on the international art market or through carefully vetted purchases from galleries and auction houses. In this current age of activism in our own community, I think it's important to be reminded of what the concerns of protesters in Ouagadougou were when they confronted President Macron there on November 27th of 2017. A coalition of 7 civil society organizations had called for demonstrations at the university during his official state visit to denounce the looting of natural resources by imperialist multinationals and the CFA as the national currency. A student's pressing question following Macron's address was about electricity cuts on campus. The French president's immediate reply was, "I do not want to deal with the electricity in Burkina Faso." His follow-up to this frustration with systemic challenges voiced on that occasion ultimately has taken the form of the SAR-Savoie report. Rather than tackle fortifying Burkina's struggling institutions and investing in their future, Macron's gesture is one that deflects and says, "Deal with your problems, here's what France has to offer." When we rally around historical injustices, such as European colonialism, we need to ask ourselves, what are true remedies that address contemporary priorities and social needs? We assume that our priorities in New York, Paris, or Berlin are the same as those on the other side of the Atlantic. There is no doubt that Africa deserves great cultural institutions. In order to achieve that, community leaders on the ground should determine what form those should take. Here in the US, we should contribute thoughtfully and generously to that effort. American institutions from the Detroit Institute of Art to the Met and the Schomburg should not fail to recognize Africa's contributions to world culture in their collections. Edifying our own public about that heritage, learning from vibrant cultural developments across sub-Saharan Africa, and partnering with institutions in the region are all ongoing opportunities.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Vishakha, for including me in this conversation. I'm going to focus briefly on examples of ways collective aesthetic activists are engaging with museums and strategies for interrupting business as usual, both for the museum's internal workings and public perception, and indeed the role assumptions are playing in an era of increased vocal outcry about past and current wrongs. For me, there are no answers, no set way to navigate these waters. I present as evidence 3 performative events as examples of the power of these actions on the literal and psychic space of the museum. So I ask, how are museums complicit in the many actions that are taking place within their facilities? As museums have become that rare animal, a public space for dialogue and debate, do they welcome these interventions and interruptions? Liberate Tate, an artist collective that was dedicated to creative disobedience against the Tate Museums until it dropped its oil company funding, was founded during a workshop on art and activism commissioned by the Tate. When Tate curators tried to censor the workshop from making interventions against Tate sponsors, even though none had even been planned, the incensed participants decided to continue their work together. So I'm showing here Human Cost. It's an 87-minute performance that took place on the 1-year anniversary of the Deep Horizon BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. It correlated with the single form exhibition dedicated to the human figure. Their stealth activist institutional critique on extraction placed the live male figure lying down in fetal position, covered with an oil-like substance, into the frame of the exhibition. Oops, sorry. For the gift, Liberate Tate carried a 54-foot turbine blade into its turbine hall. In their press release, they say, resting on the floor of your museum, it might resemble the bones of a Leviathan monster washed up from the salty depths, a suitable metaphor for the deep Arctic drilling that BP is profiting from now that the ice is melting. But it is not animal, nor is it dead. It is a living relic from a future that is aching to become the present. It is part of a magic machine, a tool of transformation, a grateful giant. And I ask, are these unsolicited artist actions, as they avail themselves to the museum's free and open spaces, becoming some of the most interesting performances and aesthetic gestures taking place inside? Sorry. Next, I turn to Sam Durant's Scaffold from 2012. First presented at Documenta, it was placed within the bucolic Karlsruhe Park. This interactive piece on state violence received no negative press, no protests, and generally positive reviews. And then, in 2014, the Walker Art Center purchased the work expressly because one of the gallows, 7 gallows, Durant referenced was used at the direction of President Abraham Lincoln to hang 38 Dakota in the town of Mankato in 1862, the largest mass execution in American history. Neither the proximity to Mankato, which is 82 miles away from Minneapolis, nor the specific significance of the structure had been perceived as problematic until it was erected on the site. And here you see it beyond the Oldenburg piece, way back there, and then you see it from the other side with the protest signs in front. After much back and forth and pressure on Olga Viso, the then director of the Walker, as well as a capitulation by the artist, the artwork was dismantled and given to the Dakota community. Durant has acknowledged that some Dakota had been water protectors at Standing Rock. It isn't hard to connect the dots between colonialism and restitution, oil extraction, and climate change. This thread is taken up by BP or not BP, with the protests at the British Museum. It is heartening to see that collective aesthetic activism worldwide is in constant dialogue, creating a web of dissent that museum goers will surely encounter. Here, around 350 activists gathered at the museum on February 19, 2019, to unfurl a flood of banners to denounce the energy company's alleged exploitation of Iraq's oil fields during the Iraq War. The action took place on the 16th anniversary of the mass demonstrations in London against the war in Iraq. The museum continues to accept funds from BP, which sponsored I Am Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria, which focuses on the art of the ancient Middle East. Sorry, I have to move this. So where is the red line, and who should be drawing it when considering what is acceptable in terms of receiving funds from various corporations, which has been at the center of many different kinds of protests? For their May 2019 event, BP and not BP organized Indigenous-led tours of the British Museum collection, including Rodney Kelly's Rebel Talk on his ancestor's shield. These spectacles play to the media for a reason, getting the word out in an oppositional stance to the conventions of museums and its assumptions of ethical behavior, with the hope of transforming them to be more responsive to righting the wrong. And yes, of course, people are still lining up to go to these museums every day. Thank you.
Thank you. So you now have a pretty wide scope, and the truth of the matter is that what connects the dots? So we're going to try to do that as we have a little conversation, and then we'll take questions also from all of you. So the one thing that struck me about your presentations is that you all really talked about the changing and ever-changing life of objects as well as institutions. So if we think about the Guggenheim, Richard, you talk about how right from the beginning it was kind of an anti-conformist institution. And yet it is now seen as part of the power structure of the New York art establishment.
Thank goodness.
And there have been people who have resisted and, have come and also done the protests as well. Alisa, you've talked about objects that actually became part of the African American movement and civil rights in a way, to really think about connecting back to the heritage that they were denied. And you were talking now about the contemporary situation whereby actually the activists are pushing to say, whose museum, who owns it, how do you make decisions, while, as you ended very well at the end, that people are flocking to the museums, they're not asking necessarily the same questions. So what is it about, is it that the art museums have been part and parcel of our political environment forever, even though we have tried to put museums above this kind of fray of the everyday? What is different now that feels different? Richard, you thought that actually issues are the same, maybe actors are different. Do you all agree, or is there something else going on that we are encountering for art museums of different sorts, because that's the important thing. People are only focusing on certain kind of museums. But what's going on now?
Well, one thing that's different is we've moved into a stage where there's a discount of expertise. So a number of people say, my opinion is as valid as yours, which may or may not be true, but I think it's very bad for civilization in the long term. That's a different situation than previously when, even though when I was on the streets in the 1960s because of Vietnam, I would never have said to someone who devoted his or her life to gaining expertise, I know more about it than you do. I mean, that's just, that wouldn't have happened.
And every opinion is the same.
Yeah, you wouldn't have, that wouldn't have been an approach that would have had any validity, for me at least. So I think one of the central questions is expertise valued or isn't it?
So that's one area we can say is really changed.
For the worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, much for the worse,
Are
yeah.
you saying that you're thinking of
Come closer to the mic.
Okay. Are you thinking of expertise in terms of, your capacity in running a museum? Or are you
No,
thinking
no,
of
I'm thinking
it
from the
in-
curatorial side,
From the
essentially. Yeah.
curatorial side?
Content, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the essence of all these museums happens to lie with the curators. I'm just there. So they actually form all the muscle, sinew, and the brains. So once.
But you're a former curator too,
Yeah,
so,
well, he didn't do very well at that, so I had to move on. But once the outside world says to this group of people, you don't know what you're talking about, or what you're talking about is not as interesting as what I'm talking about, we're in a new territory. I think we're also seeing it vis-a-vis written media. We're seeing it in many different forms in different parts of society.
yeah. Alisa?
I would say too that, increasingly every issue is reduced to such a soundbite that it's difficult to address the complexity of a lot of historical information. And for example, the issues around collecting of African art that are in European institutions. We have the very dramatic and very tragic case of the Benin Bronzes and the British punitive expedition of 1897. But then we have so many different kinds of transactions that occurred over a 100-year period, ranging from people adopting new faiths to certain kinds of objects being retired to diplomatic gifts. So many different ways that artifacts made the journey from Africa to Europe, but that's not an easy story to tell in a very condensed message. And so I think that the expertise has a very difficult time, having the conversation with the polemic of, everything is tainted, everything should go back. And so, that's one of the...
Yeah, it seems to me that at the same time, the minute you try to bring subtleties, oftentimes people would say it's just a rationalization, that therefore you're not addressing the issue. And that is one of the places that's a conundrum as to how do you actually bring the complexity without sounding like you're rationalizing something. Is another sort of an issue that comes up from the museum side. Betty?
I guess I was looking at your question very differently. I'm thinking about the notion of democratization from another perspective, because
Right.
I think that that's something sort of inherent in what Richard was talking about. I think that we have, we should celebrate the democratization of the audience. So let's just shift it over to who is coming to the museums, and why are they coming, and how many more people are going to museums than in my own youth, right? And so the needs of our audiences are completely different than they were 50 years ago. And they also, I mean, there's also this kind of tension about who gets to speak about this museum, which is kind of represented in my presentation, that there are so many more outlets for many more people's voices to sort of surface. Of course, this is much more complex than that, but there are many ways that one can speak now about how they're feeling about an exhibition, or I don't see it so much in the way of like denying the expertise of the curator exactly. I mean, I think that the dynamic is about, are you going to listen to us? Because we are the audience for what you're doing. And that's where I think the tension, though, right? I think that's a tension.
Yeah, because the tension is when say we are the audience, who is that audience?
Do you, Betti-Sue, do you have that same opinion of your doctor? Why are you listening to me? I'm the patient.
No, I don't
know. You don't have any expertise.
No, but Richard, I think there's something else going on. I mean, what I would say is that there is democratization of audience and democratization of voices. And at the same time, the folks who have taken the mantle of protest is one kind of audience.
Absolutely.
And therefore, we also have to recognize many of them are also artist activists, which is what you pointed out, that there is something visual about that. So we need to study that too. However, to say that is the only audience could also become problematic because you have multiple stakeholders and multiple audiences. And at the same time, what this groups of people who are protesting. I mean, what I was trying to figure out is the democratization also occurred to some extent in the late 60s. You know, some of my friends know this story, but I really started working with fifth grade East Cleveland public school kids and working with them with dancing Shiva in India that they didn't even know was really powerful to me because that gave me a suggestion of the social power of an art museum and art objects. That's another kind of democratization. I mean, one might argue, as Richard was saying, is that at the time, we still accepted the authorial voice of an institution. And then we tried to expand it. Now something else is going on. So part of it is to say, what is this democratization that is different from then? And where does that come from? What are the sources of that? So, you know, it's clearly around institutional structures as well as who have been excluded from museums. So, Richard, in your case, the current exhibition you have of the 6 artists responding to a permanent collection, you have many more artists of color and women than Guggenheim would have had 20 years ago. That's a big difference. Or maybe 30 years ago. No, even 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Yeah.
But they're in the collection. They're not new acquisitions.
Right.
They're there and they've been used many times.
The objects are in the collection, but the artists who were given voice to curate those.
Yeah.
That's the difference, right?
I might want to argue with Betti-Sue on another point.
Yes.
Which is I started going to museums in the 1950s. It was highly democratic, always, from being a child in a medium-sized city.
What I'm saying is that you've seen a growth in audiences, right?
Numerically.
No, yeah, numerically, that's basically what I'm saying. And with that, you have, I don't know, it seems to me that the MoMA's opening and another 45,000 square feet, right? And anyone who's been to MoMA in the last few years has felt like, oh my God, these crowds are overwhelming. I would have never felt that. I went to art school as a teenager at MoMA, and I was there every weekend. And it was generally not particularly crowded. And it was it was not as diverse in the kinds of audiences that it had. And once you open that door, then there's going to be other needs and other demands of the institution. And I think that's more of what I was trying to say, not about, I think that, I find it interesting because I don't know if the expertise of the curator is really under the gun in the same way as the authoritarian voice, the institutionality. And I think the institutionality has loosened up a lot. And one of the questions that I have in my presentation is, are museums fine with having these protests inside? You know, you've had protests inside the Guggenheim. It's not like you called the police, right?
Oh, we did.
Okay.
When it became really threatening.
When it became threatening to
Threatening
people
from
or
the
to
first
objects.
minute. The building's inherently dangerous.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to watch your granny face down on the floor because she got hyper excited and fell over the edge. That's not free speech.
Well, I guess you know where's the line? Where's that red line where you would call the police, and then sure there've been other actions where you haven't.
Right.
I know that for sure.
We know at the Whitney, actually, they allowed the protesters. But I want to kind of switch the subject a little bit, because I think that is one piece that's changing within this political context compared to the 1990s, where the attacks were coming primarily from the government and the conservative groups on the political right. Right now, the shift and the weight is more on the political left. And some people have said, what is the difference? And actually, Hu-Han Ru, who some of you know is a well-known curator, and he has recently written and talked about that, how he's very worried about the moral imperative that the activists bring. And he said, beware of that. Coming from China, he's very worried that no matter who the activists are they actually going to stop the kind of possibility of diversity of views or not? So then the question is, how do we look at those attacks of the political right in the 90s compared to what's happening from the more ultra-progressive radical groups coming from the left? Are they the same? Should they be thought of as the same? Is it about essentially, is the issue around this, in the 90s we talked about it as freedom of expression and the individual right of the artist. When it fast forward, those issues are not necessarily the same issues that are being discussed. So how do we think about that, especially from the perspective of all of you who are in institutional setting? It's easier sometimes to attack things from outside. So how do you think about this as we go forward? Alisa. Come closer to the mic. Yeah.
I don't know, it's I, as a curator, I think that one of the things that I've tried to do was to take on difficult topics and look history squarely in the face and not be timid of doing that. And I personally, I do see the danger of this moment that people will not want to take on those difficult subjects because they're too explosive. And I think that, that would be a real shame. And I think that, to Richard's first point, in a field like mine, we are so woefully ignorant of the history, and there's a real need to really lay out in many different chapters in the museum venue, the past. And I very much want to be a part of that in broadening people's educational understanding of the issues that affect my field. And I do see a moment where institutions moving forward may be intimidated by, taking on the hot
polemic,
button.
and therefore you can't actually find a new way out of that, which is very true. It's a sort of, you're shell-shocked. How do we actually create a discussion that goes beyond that? Richard, you're...
Yeah, let me say something about right and left. The current administration, in a empty show, for 3 years in a row now, has said no money for the NEA, no money for the NEH. It's not a big amount of money, but it's an incredible gesture. So the hostility from the right has, I think, transformed itself into a different
institutionalized
squeezing
frame.
mechanism.
Yeah.
Part of it has to do also with money, with the tax reform of asking certain wealthy institutions to start paying tax on endowment. To me, that's an encroachment.
Including universities.
That's what I mean, yeah, that's an encroachment. So, and next it could be art museums. If somebody like your museum has too much money, from their point of view, based on visitors, then you could start paying tax on your endowment the way Yale, Harvard, and Princeton have last year. And I think Stanford as well. In any case, I wouldn't say the right has given up in any way. It's probably, as a group of populists, it's taken a different route. So I often feel that we're in a kind of crush between the righteousness of one set and the outright hostility and ignorance of the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to recognize that, because one is very visible and the other one is happening with rules being changed, the laws being changed, that actually can also be there. And I think in a way, it's ironic that often museum staff that is more on the progressive side are actually becoming the venues of this huge resistance because people feel it's different. But then there is also the administrative structure, the power structure of institutions, and that's partly what's coming up. I want to kind of go to another topic in a slightly different way, and that is that much of this resistance has come either in the contemporary art setting or in the restitution kind of questions of the pre-modern art, especially African art, but it is moving in other directions, Native American. There is a whole movement in India that people want all objects back. But there is an issue of why both of those, contemporary and traditional objects, still remain in two separate categories of conversation, and that people don't seem to always think about them in a way that would make us understand the connection between traditional and contemporary. And it has a lot of history, obviously. So that you talked, Alisa, about the fact that Wang Yishi showed here, and she is actually between Nairobi and New York, moved to, and yet within Africa, there have not been huge amount of systems either for traditional art or for contemporary art, for that matter, and they get separated even when there are museums there. So that idea of contemporary art from formerly colonized countries or global south, along with formerly excluded communities such as Native American and African American and so forth, that there is something about global, as Richard, you talked about at the Guggenheim, that for the longest time, modern and contemporary art really meant Euro-American art, and white, basically. And that, therefore, there is this discrepancy between how we look at contemporary art from the global south, that too is a political question, and where it begins to come in together. So Mutu is now shown in the front of the Metropolitan. It is decided by contemporary art curator, talking to the director, You respect Mutu, but you were not in the conversation. So what does it say?
I think it says that things are moving in an important new direction, that artists from Africa are in a global conversation. They don't have to be limited to representing particular regions. I think at the same time, there is a certain amount of homogenization of the contemporary art world that has been happening. I was at the last Dakar Biennale, and the curator who was the organizer pointed out that Senegal has been incredibly forward-looking in terms of sponsoring this important contemporary art event for the continent for decades now, but there's no collecting of that art that happens as a result of this major event happening in Dakar. And so there, in 20 years' time, we're going to be saying the same thing about art of the 20th and 21st century that we're saying now about colonial and pre-colonial art, because none of it actually stayed in the region. So I think that I think we need to be very forward-looking, and we need to be nurturing institutions that are going to be, capturing this very dynamic moment in contemporary art in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as having it be presented in institutions here in the U.S. I mean, it's sort of...
Yeah, I think that sometimes there's a tendency that the transnational artists that once they are globally recognized, as if they don't have cultural specificity. And then it's sort of the whole idea of globality, that oftentimes people think the global does not have any context. It's not specific, it is not rooted in any way. And often people discuss these artists as if they're outside of that realm. And I think, Richard, you have worked hard to actually get expertise of the region into the institution so that the global discussion doesn't happen without understanding the regional and historical specificity.
We had two fortuitous and simultaneous things happen. One was a big bank in Switzerland, I'm sure dangerously I don't know what their background is, UBS, helped us by offering support for 3 curators, one from South America, one from Southeast Asia, and the other one for the Middle East and North Africa, to acquire about 150 objects from those 3 areas for the collection, and then make an exhibition back in those same regions and exchange educators and try and set up a true intellectual exchange between different areas. And we had support from a foundation in Vancouver, which is concerned about contemporary Chinese culture, to buy and commission art 3 different times by contemporary Chinese artists. So we had this springtime where great support from 2 very deep-pocketed parties helped us sort of open up the museum.
And you hired curators, and you...
Yeah, we got to know what we were talking about for once, yeah.
Right. And Betti-Sue, you have done work with contemporary artists from China, from South Africa, and you've been at it for a while, as a number of us were as well. How do you see the change and where this whole notion of the Global South and where artists are getting picked up? What happens to the transnational versus those artists who are very active in the region and don't always get picked up by others?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of work with China specifically in the last few years, and I would say that each region has, a different relationship to the global. I think initially the way that artists are trained is something that we overlook. What kind of education do they get? Where have they gotten that education? You'll find that a lot of the artists of a certain generation in China actually were educated in the U.S.,
Right.
France, or Britain, and then they bring those skills and those conceptual ideas from those art schools back into China. At the same time, the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing is expanding tremendously. They just a few years ago opened a large museum. And there's more than there was exhibitions of artists from the West in China. So there's a Mark Wigley, who is a professor here, is opening an exhibition in a couple of weeks of Gordon Meta Clark, which is, the quintessential New York artist, right? It's never been shown ever before in China. So when those kinds of transnational experiments or projects happen, there's a kind of cross-fertilization, and we don't really know how that's going to unfold. And I think the other part of this is this notion of being an ambassador, that once an artist is able to circulate, they are kind of put in a position of representing the nation state,
Right.
which might not be anything of their interest, but it's almost how can you shake that and then become that individual, that creative, imaginative individual that Hu Hanru kind of imagines and who he supports. So I think that all of those things are kind of wrapped into it.
I think that right there, it seems to me, is the crux of the issue, that especially in the contemporary art setting, that artists are individuals, they're picking things up from wherever you can find it. It's sort of what Arthur Danto used to say, that artists can look at the cracks in the sidewalk, and it's the weed that might give them the imagination. And yet, we box them in the nation-state category. And that in itself becomes a problem, whether it's historical or contemporary art in some ways. But what does seem to me like, and it's the last question, and then we'll try to move forward, and that is that there is something in the restitution question, in protest, in what people are talking about is around ethical dimension of museums, right? So the protesters today are saying that it is really about the ethics of a museum, whether it's about objects going back or it's about whose money is coming in. And yet, they're defining ethics in a particular way. So any thoughts on how we think about the ethical dimension of museums? What is museums' responsibility as ethical institutions?
Well, I think trustees are obliged to police and vet one another. So that's a central sort of cleansing activity. And then beyond that, I think staff owes it to civilization at large to make certain that whatever assertions are made, both physically and intellectually, are the very best thing that the curator could come up with. And then my job now more than ever is to find out if the donor is someone that you might want to have dinner with, So I think we've got a new sort of more tightly strung together net in looking at who's supporting this and why.
And therefore, you're saying that we do have that obligation to the society to ask those questions.
Well, I think it's wonderful that liberals in particular love to eat up each other. So I'll participate up to a certain level. I don't find our brethren on the other side of the aisle being nearly so righteous. But since we're obliged to be, hypersensitive, I can go along with it up to a certain moment, yeah.
Any other thoughts?
And I feel strongly that, a museum's acquisition policy should be an ethical one where, there are strict guidelines, where, the laws that are in place are, respected. And, we've been, extremely rigorous about that in my department. I think that, in terms of revisiting history, and applying our contemporary ethics to the past when it comes to museums, that is, a quite complicated exercise. And
But, I mean, isn't it possible to actually revisit history and lay it bare? Because let's say the Benin bronzes. What if you had a label that actually talked about how they were taken? So it's not just the original context, but that context and the new context that actually means something else. What if we did that?
Well, actually, we do have that kind of discussion in our labels. I think that
You do it more than many others, it's true.
Yeah, I mean, we discuss it. I mean, I think it's, in terms of our position with the Benin bronzes that we have, those are pieces that circulated in many different private hands before they ultimately were given to the museum. And the Oba of Benin has said that there are works in institutions globally that he considers to be cultural ambassadors. And so that is the role that those works play for us in our institution. And I think that it is a very important and very, powerful dimension of understanding that material. I think it's also important that our public, Benin bronzes were the favorite of W.E. Du Bois. He wanted to be identified with that aspect of African civilization. And so I think that it's important for our audiences to know that artists at the court of Benin were creating those bronzes at the same time that Donatello was, creating works in the same, with the same technology, and that artists in Africa developed that independently of Europe, and that, you have a parallel trajectory in the history of art that is equally great. And so, that is, we're
So it's like the multiple histories of the same object as they traverse through time and space.
I think we have to be clear about that provenance. Yeah. We have it with every single object in our collection. Everything in our collection is online with its provenance. There's no mystery about what we have. And I think that is an important service to the public. I think that, as a curator, I've done research in a lot of collections internationally, and it is perplexing to me that as an expert, I can go into certain European institutions and I have a hard time finding things that I know are there. So I think that this moment of transparency for some of the huge repositories of works in my field has to be about making that historical information accessible.
And make it visible to people, that's the thing. So last question, and we're going to open it up to all of you, and that is for you, Betti-Sue. Where do we go from here? You said you don't have an answer, so I'm going to put you on the spot. Because you've actually looked at the protest also from the performative and visual side, so.
Right. I mean, I'm personally very interested in the aesthetics and the artistic aspects of these projects. And I don't think that thinking about fossil fuels and climate change is actually so much about like the left or the right, actually. I mean, I think that there's a pretty strong consensus amongst many people and nations that we have to do something about it. So while the museum has within its collections many sort of symbolic objects, these acts are also symbolic. And that's why they belong within the museum context. So I think, clearly conversations, and you asked about sort of the contemporary and the historic, I would say the same thing. Put these put people together and have the conversations and allow the non-expert into the room with the expert so that the non-expert can become more expert and the expert can be more aware of the ways to communicate and to provide systems of thought for better understanding. So the museum can play a role in the sort of larger policy issues if we go about it that way.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to open it up to all of you, and please come to the microphone if you have a question, and we'll try to take 2 or 3 questions together. And raise your hand and identify yourself. Please, come, Corey.
I always like to start things off.
Absolutely. And we're delighted you can. And just line up.
Oh, well, I guess I'm the line.
Yeah, you're the line, right?
So this, I'm Carrie Lovelace, and this question is for Richard Armstrong. And it was sort of, actually, Betti-Sue, you kind of took a little air out of my questions. It's still not working.
No,
Is
you're
that
good.
right? Okay,
You're
there
good.
you, okay. So it was about the question of expertise, and I'm, you know, I have 2 feelings myself about that. One is that I agree with you about the loss of and the loss of the respect for expertise, but also as a woman, I remember that, you know, where that attack began, which was with the women's movement and feminism, where there was that feeling that authority and expertise was used to exclude other voices, you know, and because, you know, there was a sense of what quality was, and quality was a certain thing, and these other people didn't have that quality. But the price that's paid for that, I agree, is that then, you know, then there are no, you know, what are the standards? How do you judge, you know, we do judge things, how do you, you know, bring a sense of discernment back? So my question is, given that we are in that state now, and we, you know, that we are in where there is an attack on expertise and there everything is sort of equal, but you know, really it's not. How do you see a way forward to both acknowledging the diversity of voices, but then bringing back that sense of discernment and expertise?
Well, I hope so, but I'm not particularly sanguine.
Then why not?
I don't feel very good about where we're headed. So, I mean, there's a way you can link populism to the attack on expertise. So to me, that these are very troubling parallel efforts at disruption that are not liberating ultimately. We have to say to one another, certain things are better than certain other things. Now, which of those are we going to preserve for the next generations? The ones that happen to be relevant to us, or ones that we think as a collective group are better than others? And the triumph of relevancy is, to me, unattractive and a sign of a big kind of decay.
Well, I guess my question is beyond the criticism of that.
Yeah, how can I make it positive? I can't because I'm Scottish.
Go ahead.
So I think it really comes down to a matter of trust, right? You asked the question of whether or not the opinion of a doctor would be taken as a point of expertise. But we also know that there are many doctors who have many opinions, and they may give you an opinion based on their point of view, their level of training, their level of exposure, et cetera. So my question to you is, and to everyone on the panel, what do you see your role as, or do you see your role as heads or particularly leaders in cultural institutions as one of trust and building trust with the public that you serve? And if so, what are you doing specifically to try to address the disconnect in trust, which is really what's driving the disconnect in what one might view as expertise, or trust that the expertise is actually authentic and something that they should buy into?
Yeah, before they answer, let me just actually say that what's very interesting about that question is the issue of audiences. Because today, most of the surveys show that majority of the people going to museums still trust museums. Museums are among the most trusted places. So then you have to distinguish between those who feel the trust is broken versus those who feel that this is the place I respect. It's one of the most respected institutions in terms of civil society. So it'll be important to make that distinction, and yet it is true that there's a visible disparity that is being seen in the museum world, because ultimately it's also about other disparities that exist all around us. So I don't deny that there is the issue, but I just wanted to put it out there that the surveys that have been done actually showing the numbers of museums, people who go to museums, and a much larger number suggest that people like going to museums, and they trust museums, and they trust what museums do. So it's an important question to ask, actually.
And I just want to, I didn't want to put that fine of a point on it, but with the audiences changing and changing as rapidly as they are, those perceptions of whether or not, the answers are,
Right.
universal, I would challenge your position that those are universal and actually should be applied universally. I would say they're changing and dynamic, and that we can't just say that because one survey said that they are trusted institutions. I think it's an evolving dynamic.
Agree entirely, yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by trust. I mean, I trust all the people who come in the museum. I hope they don't break anything, but in general, I find them, praiseworthy people. Do they trust the museum? I'm not sure. Is that what you're asking?
No, what I'm asking is, do you view your role as being one of building, restoring, engaging, driving trust amongst a population that's changing, that may not trust you or the Guggenheim to present things fairly, squarely, or in a manner that is reflective of their opinions or their own learning and their knowledge?
Yeah, I would hope that our effort is concentric with their expectations. Does that give you some answer?
Yeah.
If you feel it does.
Yeah.
I mean,
Alisa?
I guess what I think of when I hear your question is that, as a curator in a large institution, you have to wind up being a strong advocate for your particular area of the collection and the programming. And in a place like mine, it's a very competitive contact sport. You really have to sort of, stand your ground. And I think that in my role, my responsibility to instill trust in people that I care very passionately about the representation of the field is that I don't accept that we should be complacent about what we've done, that there should be a constant pushing for new projects that expand the horizons of what we have done in the past, and that we should not be satisfied with our permanent installation. It's in vast need of renewal. So I have to be a very active participant in making sure that those kinds of initiatives get across the finish line. It's not always that visible to the public because these things, an exhibition takes 3 years to research and to execute, but I hope that the fact that we continually are in those kinds of cycles builds an audience that expects a certain kind of rigor and an expansive perspective that they can only find, in our programs. so that they look to us. I was very moved. I was walking through our galleries the other day, and a visitor came up to me and he said that he comes once a year to see what new Africa programming or projects we have online. And he comes all the way from California to do that. So we have built a certain following, people like that who know that it's not a still program, that it's not static.
Thank you. Last question, and then we'll take one or two questions because I want to make sure that I get as many questions as possible. Yeah.
Dr. Armstrong, I'll begin by saying I know less than you. On the question of acquisition in view of recent events, I'm sure all of you have reflected upon this. Are there new criteria for not only acquiring new items, but the existing items in your collections? I think that's my...
Well, we have a very limited budget. We tend to buy works that were made after 1965. There's never any question about provenance, and we're subject to the market, so we pay the price that you would pay typically. Now, we go through constant research about things that may have been acquired earlier in the collection, particularly in the 1930s, and where were they and who owned them and how did they come into the collection of the eventual donor. But I think we have an easy path in acquisitions because we're frequently buying things that were made last year.
On the question of donors, also with increased focus recently in New York, have you established, again, new criteria? Where do you draw the line? It's such a complex issue.
Well, I think the trustees are obliged to vet donors, and as they do when we're involved to some degree, but the real fiduciaries for the institution, and to a large degree its continuous conscience, must be the trustees. So we follow their direction.
And you did, for example, in case of the Sackler, you decided to sever that relationship, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's partly part of your question, yeah. Ross?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you all. Listening to you, I've been convinced that the museum is a very specific and special theater of the contradictions of democracy at this moment. And, each of you have spoken in some ways, both for and against, the presumption that there ought to be a more inclusive and equitable representational function at the level of audience, at the level of collection, at the level of curatorial staff. And on the other hand, of course, the flip side of this is the custodial function, the exercise of judgment, the making of distinctions and the production of distinction and cultural capital. And these things are, inevitably in contradiction. And of course, as democracy is just, eviscerated in the rest of the cultural space that we inhabit, this theater seems to become more and more charged, and these performances become more and more important. But I have another question for you all, which has to do with the other part of the institutions for presenting art. That is, if one is collecting things that increasingly are understood in terms of their representational function, representations of tradition, groups, communities, histories, what happens to that other part of the art institution, which is the creation of spaces in which unintelligible, radically critical, unprecedented things can be said and put into the discourse that by definition can't represent what is in the social space? And most of you have spoken more in terms of the custodial function. I'm wondering if that other question, that radical part of the art mandate, is got a place in this conversation.
That's beyond being a product of a place and time.
Critical function, not just the scene of a protest, but the allowing for certain kinds of interventions that, as I said, call very radically into question the presumptions with which everyone might read everything else in that space.
Right.
Well, easy for us because we have a revolutionary building. So you might remember 8 years ago, we invited Tino Segal into the institution. To me, that was a radical act, and it was quite cleansing at the same time. And subsequently, we've had Terrell in there and Maurizio Catalan, and I think we've been fairly committed to making certain that the status quo is challenged. But beyond that, as you say, that an artist who's really burning bright is given the opportunity to go as far as he or she cares to.
I mean, I do hear what you're saying, and I think perhaps the Guggenheim has a special role, and it's not quite like the other institutions. But, for example, Alisa, I mean, whether one signifies some of those bronzes as being especially good examples of a whole tradition, or as the singular accomplishment and perhaps breaking of a set of rules within that tradition. Right. I mean, it seems like that question could be asked there too.
Yeah. I mean, I think actually one of the things you might talk about is that some of the exhibitions you've done are very much to try to individualize and look at this not just a representation of a whole culture, but something that breaks tradition. I mean, that's one of the things as a pre-modern Asianist or Indianist, often I've really pushed against this idea of everything being essence of the spiritual and the ever-changing or never-changing, and really look at it in a political context, the particular moment in time, and at the same time, the radicality of individual works that artists are capable of making even in traditional societies, which we don't always think about. So it's like what may be radical for you would be to change the perception of something, but for contemporary art practice, it's something different, right?
Yeah, I mean, to Vishakha's point, I mean, there are so many fundamental misapprehensions about major works in the African art corpus that almost every project is an opportunity to debunk those. I mean, the idea that every representation is just a generic person, was one that we tried to address with looking at issues of portraiture and what can that look like in traditions that we're less familiar with. What is a reliquary? We think of African art and the spiritual traditions that undergird some of the great forms of expression from Central Africa as being so exotic, but they're really not so fundamentally different than Christianity, and trying to get people to think in terms of systems of thought that are distinct and yet have very interesting parallels. So, I mean, I think of each of the projects that we generate as an opportunity to take a conceptual topic and get people to think a little bit differently about something that they assume they know something about. And I think that one of the things that's gratifying about working in a museum these days is that contemporary artists are so interested in historical art and are, really using our collections as springboards for, innovative developments of their own. So that is, one of the...
Betti-Sue, you might want to actually answer this question of radicality of something existing that goes beyond being a representation of a place in time.
So I was teaching a course for a couple of years that was called Art and Social Criticism. And so, I was looking at all kinds of commentary to politics, to activism, et cetera. And I did start to feel exhausted by that just personally. And so more recently, last spring, I taught a class that was about feminist and queer radical artistic practices, which opened up the discourse to very, very radical and really practically unreadable kinds of work. I think that was sort of at the core of your question, to things that are provocative and shocking, not for their politics, but maybe for their eroticism, for example, or the way that they break code in one way or another. And I feel like ultimately we absolutely need those kinds of outliers, or, you know, the most sort of extreme kind of investigations of consciousness in order to kind of refuel, ultimately, at least for me personally, I felt like I needed that after having kind of focused, let's just call it, on the political. And so I think maybe it's a seesaw for me personally, that I kind of need both, and that we all are kind of figuring that out, you know, as people. And again, you know, the importance of collectivity, which I stressed in my presentation earlier, is really sort of also about the importance of individuality. And I think that in many museums, the importance of individuality has a much sort of, there's much more of it, right? There's many more objects that are made by a single person or a person and their assistants in a workshop than there are objects that are made by a community or a collective group. So I think, you know, there's many ways to go with it, but I like your question.
I mean, I think partly what it does raise, and it comes to the crux of this notion of that art is not just reading a book. Art has a capacity to create another world that you didn't even think is possible. It has that capacity for imagination, about making you think differently, to alter your perception. And oftentimes when it gets instrumentalized only one way or one kind of representation, you lose that idea. And how do we actually keep both of those alive? Mm-hmm. That there is a history, there is its politics, there is its kind of a trajectory and genealogy, but there is also a thing that exists that makes you think of things that you never thought was even possible or imagine that it was real. Yeah, and that is the kind of the conundrum that we have to continue to work with as we go forward, and not get only to the one side or the other side of that particular issue. So please join me in thanking our great panelists for this discussion, and all of you for being there. Thank you. Now you can go home and watch the debate.
Real impact. We're living in a nowhere.
Our future.